All right, we'll try to get through this um, as quickly as possible. Again, there's no really easy way to get through events, especially like very important transitionary events, in a quick fashion. But that is what we're sort of faced with in a survey course like this. So, what we're going to try to do is bridge ourselves here. So we've been talking about like the 1960s, the 1950s, 1960s civil rights movement. Then you watched the development of the second wave feminist movement, sort of out of the civil rights movement as well. And we'll talk a little bit about that and its meaning and kind of how we understand um, movements for social justice and movements for greater acceptance and recognition of varied identities in the United States today, and they are sort of in this decade here. But sort of the title of this, like One Nation Divided, kind of implying that you know clearly the United States is still one unified country, but it's beginning to fracture in ways that I think we can possibly you know, point to this post civil rights era as sort of a fracturing in at least how the country conceives of um, its ideals, its values, and how a lot of that is politicized today. So, what we're going to do is talk about the rise of this new left from these activists that developed or formed in the 1970s, and then we'll take a look at this sort of transition. So Richard Nixon historians kind of look at as being both a liberal and conservative president, and I'll explain a little bit what that means as far as this shift in sort of like political alignment in the United States once again, as we'll see a massive shift in how people identify politically, and also what that means as far as like how political parties are also evolving. Because as I've told you over and over again, um, political affiliation, political ideology, political platforms in this country change, adapt, evolve. They never remain exactly the same. So, what one party was in the 1920s is not anywhere close a lot of times to what it is today. And these things shift and change, and we'll try to look at some of those developments. All right, so the new left, and what is that exactly? Well, it really forms with younger um, Americans at the time. So those who were your age, they were in college, and when all of this is happening, so all these major global events are kind of having an impact either directly or indirectly on their lives. They're becoming, they're at the age where they are, on college campuses. They're being exposed a lot of times to, more diverse points of view and populations and people, and becoming sort of like politically conscious at the same time. And so they they grab onto the sort of the approach that was used by African Americans to push for civil rights as like well, grassroots, right? Because grassroots, we know, is when people at like these local levels begin to coordinate and work together. So think back, the civil rights lecture, the Montgomery bus boycott, right? That was a local. That's grassroots. The diner sit-ins, those are grassroots, right? There's no like large, for the most part, there's no large like federal agency that is directing activism. This is just people coordinating and organizing and going out and enacting whatever they feel is going to bring about the change that they want. And so there was a national organization formed called the Students for a Democratic Society (SDS), and and this becomes like a kind of a radical um, uh, activist group. And as you can see there, it's beginning to look at systems of power. So that's, when you look at hierarchy, bureaucracy, those are words that are um, descriptive of a system that has power. And so they are rejecting, not like, so rejecting an inherited system of hierarchy and bureaucracy is not the same as rejecting those things outright. It's not necessarily they're not calling for anarchy, basically, right? They're not saying, like, abolish all, systems of power. That's not what they're advocating for. They're advocating, or they're looking at what are these current systems that we have in place that have power over people, whether it be something like the federal government, local government, or things like police forces, right? Like, so they look at these things and they say, well, these current systems that we have um, are corrupt. So that's what they're rejecting. They're rejecting that system that is in place and wanting to completely remake it. That's why it says called for a new democratic movement in America, right? It's like kind of like thinking back to when we were looking at the Gilded Age and how the progressive era came sort of out of these decades in the United States where the people believed there was a lot of corruption, and they were trying to reject this uh, the encroachment of capitalist and economic interests at the that have encroached onto the political system at the expense of people's livelihoods. And so this movement as well is sort of looking at this the same way, that there we have an unjust system that needs to be sort of reformed, extent like almost to the revolutionary point, but not like they're ready to fight or anything like that. And this really boiled over in the 1968 presidential election. I'm not going to link to anything in this with this lecture, because I have another video I want you to watch instead. But if you have some time and you want to, I know there's images out there and video on YouTube of the riots that took place during the 1968 presidential election, specifically targeting the Democratic National Convention that went on in Chicago. Because remember, what's happening is uh, Lyndon Johnson, who became president after JFK was assassinated, he was because of the strain and you know well, he won the reelection in 1964, and then he was allowed to run for a second term. Remember, because even if you become president after even if you're a vice president and become president, you still get 2 terms yourself to run. And so there was a question of whether or not he's the incumbent, whether he was going to run again in 1968. But of course, he had already Johnson really wanted to help bring about an end to poverty. So that's what, Johnson had launched a war on poverty, which will be very important when we talk about in our next lecture the rise of modern conservatism in the United States. But he also um, he also had already, the 1964 and 65 Civil Rights Acts. So he'd already made 2 major domestic achievements that helped American people. But it was the foreign policy, United States international uh, uh, actions that were straining on Johnson, and that one of those included, obviously, well, the main thing obviously is the Vietnam War. The Vietnam War was still raging in 1968. The anti-war processes that we've talked about are going on, and so he basically said he's not running for re-election. So that meant you had an open uh, competition for the Democratic nominee, and same with the Republicans. The Republican Party and the Democratic Party are both trying to find a candidate to run for president. So So obviously the activists, um, the uh, you know, they are going to target the the current power. So the Democratic Party held power at this time. Johnson was a Democrat. He's in the White House. The Democratic Party is seen as the one with blood on its hands for the continuation of the Vietnam War. So that is the target. That's why they target the Democratic National Convention in Chicago to hold protests. And there's like I get again, you can, if you want to look at these some of the footage on YouTube, you can, but it's a pretty intense confrontation between activists and the police. The SDS was there, kind of coordinating this, but a lot of what happened afterwards, because of the just how violent and you know the amount of tension that sort of was a product of these these riots uh, created a lot of pushback against the SDS, and it sort of dissolved then after that. But as we know, like any sort of movement, right? If it doesn't matter, the organization in it, the organization in itself can go away, but the message will stay, right? And that message remained. But you can see that again, uh, Richard Nixon wins the 1968 election pretty significantly. You can see there's a few southern states there that this was. Oh, and now I'm blanking on his name, who ran on segregation. Um, George Wallace in the South, uh, who delivered his famous segregation now, segregation tomorrow, segregation forever. He won some of the former, deep Southern Confederate, former Confederate states, but for the most part, the country shifted and uh, um, voted for Nixon. And this was supposed to be. Let me see if I can. Let's try this real quick because I do want to show. Um, yeah, there we go. So this is the flip I was talking about. So look, this is the 1964 election in which Johnson won re-election, and the blue represents the Democratic Party, right? So you can see, and remember, the last time we saw this sort of major shift in how people voted was with FDR um, in in the 1932 election, where a lot of like more people voted Democrat for the first time, and the Democratic Party, for the most part, because of sort of FDR's legacy, had been the predominant party that people voted for in the United States. But because of things with Vietnam and the Democratic Party being associated with that, you can see then the get out of here. The 1968 election, there's another major shift, and Nixon wins. And something else that's important to note, and we don't, I mean, I'm not going to be able to do it any sort of justice, but I kind of want to jump off the last video that you watched to kind of explain some things here as far as like how does activism look like, or how did it look like, what does it look like now, um, in these decades since the civil rights movement. And that's really like it's diversified, right? And a lot of this is sort of driven. So, for example, um, the the documentary on second wave feminism and the push for the Equal Rights Amendment, and then how there were, even women who were opposed to the ERA, like Phyllis Schlafly, who you saw highlighted. And if you have not watched that documentary, you need to do so. There will be some exam questions coming from that. Um, but it's this belief then that, okay, so okay, what women were still you know not socially equal. You know, what they made as far as income was not as much as men. Still very much, for the most part, in like kind of like a believed, in going into the early 1960s, the belief that kind of inheriting the old Cold War gender roles, that women were expected to get married and have a family, right? And that was it. And like you had to give. I remember from the reading, the poll or the surveys that were conducted, a woman just sort of, well, I can either have a career or be, it's like there was this either or that, and these sort of thing, women faced greater challenges to achieve certain um, uh, goals in life that men did not. But okay, for the most part, you probably kind of gathered, at least picked up some in the documentary, that we're looking at like mainly kind of like white middle upper class women, right? That's who is sort of like like pushing for the ERA and the the second wave feminism are sort of led by white women. But what happens if you are a black woman? What happens if you are a a gay woman, right? So it's like, how does your identity still maintain some importance in these movements? And that's why, so the 1970s, that's where there was this huge diversification of all this activism, because there were those, and as you see in that term there at the bottom, intersectionality, that's what this is. It's someone being aware that as a black woman, I feel these forms of oppression differently, right? Because there are aspects of racism also that affect a black woman that do not affect white women, right? So it's like being conscious of how you yourself construct your identity in relation to systems of power and these other things that inform your identity, like heritage, culture, right? And then some of these sort of forms of identification that are imposed on you by political systems, right? So how do all of these things work to form who you are and what you think are, or what should be the rights acknowledged for you as well? So that's where the 1970s, that's where it sort of, the 1950s and 1960s civil rights movement breaks, into sort of all of these different groups that are trying to push for. They use that momentum of the civil rights movement to start to push for specific things that are, that even though the civil rights acts helped, um, a lot of people of color, it was predominantly focused on overturning Jim Crow laws. But we also know that Native Americans, the indigenous population, did not cope with that in the same way that African Americans did. So there's different things that are important to them to achieve in these movements, and that's where we see like Richard Oakes, who, if you remember back on that sheet I gave you, he was listed on there, and that is actually, I did link a video, because what happens in the 1960s, led by Richard Oakes, is this sort of Native American liberation movement, or reclamation, I should probably call it, movement, where a lot of different Native American tribes join together, and they actually go to the island of Alcatraz off the coast of San Francisco, where the prison was, because by this point it was disbanded. It was no longer, Alcatraz was no longer operating as a federal penitentiary by the late 1960s. So they went there and they occupied it in a demonstration to um, raise awareness about the history of Native Americans in relation to the United States government. And so he reads a proclamation about what the movement is and supposed to be. So I really want you to make sure you watch that as well. But that's sort of the idea. I want to kind of like, that's one of the main things, right? This social movement. And we'll kind of come back and tie some things together there. All right, but quickly, just going to run through some stuff here with Nixon. How is he both liberal and a conservative? And again, how we apply political labels also, because political ideologies and parties shift and adapt and change. How we apply those labels does as well, right? We talked already what was classical liberalism, right? Well, classical liberalism was um, this belief that any form of government intrusion was a form of oppression or tyranny, right? So it was this idea of, because classical liberalism came out of the Enlightenment, in which there were still very rigid systems of absolutism and monarchical rule in Europe. So this idea that there's an absolute ruler that whose power cannot be questioned created these forms of classical liberalism, in which, well, no, that's too oppressive. But then remember, we saw that shifted in the United States, specifically with the populist movement and then the progressive era, and that there was began to sort of evolve a new like kind of a more modern liberalism, in which, well, no, liberalism should be guaranteeing the liberal welfare of each person, and that requires working with systems of power, because clearly, if there's a corporation whose only objective is to profit, it's not going to care what happens to its employees, right? So the liberal welfare of the employee is disregarded at the expense of profit, and that was sort of like the Gilded Age, excess, uh, you know, laissez-faire economics that had overrun America and politics, and so it was a pushback against that. So you grow government. Liberalism then became, you grow government to protect the most vulnerable. And so again, so the idea is just to always keep in mind that these things shift and change. Where conservatism, being conservative, um, that always was sort of maintaining a kind of a traditional outlook on how uh, society should be structured and how politics should be structured. So the best way to kind of explain that, then, the evolution of conservative politics is really kind of just in response to what's happening with how liberal politics is being shaped. So anyway, as noted, Nixon wins the '68 election, um, and he ran on this platform of, so the silent majority. This became something that Nixon invoked during his campaign, because he said that um, the protesters, the anti-war demonstrators, they are very loud, they're out there, but they are the minority. Just because they're the loudest doesn't mean that they are the most they have the biggest following. So he appealed to, like, what he felt were just people who were not out being activists, who were just sitting at home, and he called them the silent majority. Right? They're not the ones out making noise. They're quiet, but they are the majority. So he tried to appeal to them. And then, yeah, he believed that for the most part, most Americans were not represented in these radical movements that he saw developing. And so, um, to kind of frame him, then he remained liberal, right? Because he becomes president during this era of the liberal consensus. Remember, the liberal consensus, in which both the Democratic and Republican parties sort of, for the most part, had very similar goals and objectives. So he's a product of that sort of political ideology. So he still remains liberal in some regards, as we kind of now are conceiving of modern forms of liberalism and conservatism, but he was still conservative in others. And so one of these things is, Nixon took advantage of sort of a rift between the Russo Sino split in the 1970s. Basically, it's when the Soviet Union, the communist Soviet Union, and communist China began sort of quarreling, having disagreements on their futures. And Nixon took advantage of that and actually went and met with Mao Zedong, that you see pictured there, that he's shaking the hand of, who was the Chinese um, uh, premier at the time, the leader of China. And so trying to create a better relationship with China at the expense of Russia, the Soviet Union. And He also began a process of trying to get the United States out of Vietnam, and that was called Vietnamization, which was basically the United States would slowly start to pull troops out and turn the war over to the South Vietnamese. And and so he also the Great Society. So that was, as I mentioned earlier, that was Lyndon Johnson, LBJ. That's who Lyndon Johnson is. That was his war on poverty. It was trying to create social safety nets in place to where no one in the United States would ever fall to poverty. Um, and so Nixon will support some aspects of that as well. So he remains liberal in that sense, right? But also, um, he pushed back against some aspects of the Great Society programs. So he's not going to support the full extent of these welfare programs. And he also enacted in the 1968 election what became known as the Southern Strategy. So trying to get Southern Democrats to vote Republican is what Nixon attempted to do, and that plan involved sort of um, taking the racial tension uh, that had always been um, in American politics and still is, but trying to basically it was trying to speak to white voters in the South, specifically white Democrats, because he wants to get their vote. And it's basically telling white voters that the problems that they're facing have nothing to do with um, race or their perceptions of how a racial caste system should still be in place, right? Because Jim Crow laws were deemed deemed unconstitutional with the Civil Rights Act of 1964, so they're gone. So in 19 so 4 years after Jim Crow laws are abolished, Nixon is trying to speak to white Southern voters by saying, oh look, government's just doing too much and messing with your lives. We need to acknowledge that government overreach is the problem here, and forcing people to accept racial integration is government overreach, right? So it's trying to it's trying to talk about racism without saying or acknowledging that racial tension exists. That's the Southern strategy that Nixon tried to employ, and it worked. But basically, what it does is it cloaks racist policies in other things, right? So it's like um, it tries to appease people's racist beliefs by pretending that the issue is not their racism, the issue is something else, right? And that's what happened with the Southern strategy. Um, and then we see how these tensions carry on. So I'm going to quickly run through these because I see I'm at 28 minutes already. Um, Watergate. This is something, if you're not familiar with, hopefully you will be. This was when Nixon, when it came time for his reelection, um, had some of his operatives that were known as the Plumbers, these secret group that Nixon had, to break into the Democratic National Convention headquarters and try to get information on his opponent, so that he could craft out a reelection campaign because he was going to be running for president again. Um, and so that happens in 72. He is reelected, but then slowly and surely, more and more um, information comes out. There are leaks about what happened, and then eventually an investigation by some reporters for the Washington Post reveal that Nixon and his party did indeed spy, essentially, and steal information from the Democratic Party, which became a huge scandal. And he resigns in 1974, and uh, Gerald Ford, who was elected president after him, or who assumed his presidency, I'm sorry, who became president after him, pardoned Nixon, so he couldn't be charged with anything, basically absolving him of anything. I know, I'm sorry, that there's a lot more that goes on with Watergate that I can't really get into right now. Um, economic tensions in the United States. So what had been happening since the end of the Second World War, slowly globalization and the rise of other economic and industrial powers in the world directly were challenging a market that the United States had sort of built its economic prosperity off of. And that really was the steel industry that was driven by the auto industry. Because going back to Henry Ford, and Carnegie and the building of these large conglomerates of steel and auto that very much relied on each other, right? Because the auto industry needs steel. So these two industries that were powerhouses for the United States are gone by the 1970s for the most part. Not like, I mean, there still are steel industry, there's still auto industries, but their international prestige, pull, and revenue is severely undercut by the rise of other. So for example, like Japan by the 1970s had really rebuilt its economy, and it was being competitive with U.S. automakers internationally. Same with the rise of the German auto market as well. So when the United States auto market begins to decline, that's going to affect the steel industry. And then, of course, the chain of events led to the closing of various auto plants, steel plants, um, that really decimate the United States economically in these areas now that these former industrial steel powerhouses that you see on the map there became known as the Rust Belt. And so that's going to lead to unemployment, right? Because if you have factories closing, those people are losing their jobs. Um, and then people's real wages, the power of the dollar begins to drop. And what happened was stagflation, where there's a stagnant economy, high unemployment, meaning, so it's a high number of unemployed, and there's inflation as well. And there's really no easy fix to that type of economy, because if you try to attack unemployment, it makes inflation go up. If you try to take care of inflation, a lot of times that will lead to higher unemployment. So it's just the United States had a lot of economic turmoil at the time, and part of that is also was led to the oil embargo placed on the United States by the Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries in the Middle East that formed this organization as a way to carve out political power, because we know that even today, most of the oil that is exported globally comes from the Middle East, and by forming OPEC, these countries joined together to agree to um, uh, essentially put sanctions on other countries by refusing to sell them oil that they need for gas, petroleum. I mean, refused to sell them petroleum that they need for gas, which leads to shortages, which led to large, that you can see in the picture there, led to very large gas lines, because the United States had also built itself very much dependent on the automobile. So that means it's very dependent on gasoline, and all these things are connected, right? And so it created another sort of crisis. And so then what happened really was um, part of like, so all of these things are coming together now, and it's creating sort of now a pushback against the continued activism that people began to, like these, so like the diversification that I talked about earlier. There's a real pushback on that by some Americans in the 1970s who are also feeling, who are unemployed now, feeling some of these larger changes in their lives, and they look at the say for example, they look at something like the Chicano movement, and they see it as something that is a continued drain on the American system. So in some ways, politicians um, uh, sort of scapegoated some of the problems that America faced that were very much a product of political choices onto the people, the social activists. And what it did is it sort of uh, it created this sort of competition for American values. And what we now see in today, I think, in some ways, when people talk about identity politics, well, what do they mean, right? how can somebody be a political actor without an identity? It's impossible. But when someone uses the words identity politics, what they're referring to is a lot of what we see developing here in the 1970s. A group of people whose identity had been suppressed and never allowed to really be acknowledged by the systems of power in place are now trying to have a seat at the table and have an equal voice in how politics are shaped and formed. And those who do not want to give up these privileged places of inherited power view that as a like an encroachment on their authority. And so it's, that's where kind of this pejorative in how, when it's used in that way, of identity politics comes in. And of course, these other things that are a part of it, the liberal the liberal consensus ended in the 1970s. The Democratic and Republican parties, as we will see going into the 1980s, are really now pushing into the opposite directions, away from each other, after the this 1970s sort of split and rift, and sort of like how we see emerging these modern political parties begins to take form here in the 1970s. And we'll continue sort of this discussion. I'm past 36, and I'm much longer than I wanted to go. We'll continue to explore all this stuff in the next lecture when we talk about sort of like the rise of modern conservatism in the United States.